At 9 a.m., three Russian MiG-31s entered Estonian airspace with their transponders off and radios muted, an act that pushed NATO and Russia to the brink of a full-blown international incident. For nearly 20 minutes, no one on the ground knew that a miscalculation here could have triggered the biggest aerial confrontation in the Baltic in decades. But the question is, how much worse did this encounter come? And what would have happened if only one pilot on each side had misinterpreted the signals? Stay tuned, because in the next part, we'll analyze the timeline, tactics, and technology that turned an ordinary morning into a risky test of NATO's air defense discipline. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like it and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. As the MiG soared, their engines blazing like miniature suns on the frigid edge of the stratosphere, the Italians watched their climb with the stoic patience of predators who knew exactly how the chase would end. Inside the MiG cockpits, the tone shifted from confident to bewildered. Their SPO-15 receivers, overloaded with noise they couldn't decipher, kept chirping, false alarms, and conflicting warnings. It was an electronic migraine at 30,000 feet. The reason was simple. The F-35's Barracuda electronic warfare suite had begun to draw ghosts, duplicate radar signals deliberately offset in time and frequency. The MiG saw 12 targets, then 4, then 0, then 20. A sky full of enemies that didn't exist. This wasn't jamming in the traditional sense. This was deception warfare. The Barracuda had picked up the MiG's own radar pulses, modified them, and returned them with enough delay to suggest that an entire squadron was approaching from multiple directions. The Russians weren't fighting NATO. They were fighting the illusions of their own radar. And that's exactly where the Swedish Gripens showed up. For nearly 20 minutes, the Swedes had been circling in radio silence 80 kilometers away, their radars off, using Link 16 to observe everything the F-35 saw. When the Gripens suddenly turned on their PS-05A pulse Doppler radars at full power, the MiG's warning receivers went from a vague crackle to full-blown panic. Two new targets, 180 degrees away, were closing in fast. The Russians had assumed this was a 2-on-3 chase. Now it was an omnidirectional convergence. Here's why it matters. In dogfights, being squeezed is a death sentence. When you're being attacked from multiple directions, your options for movement become narrower. Every turn you make affects your ability to control your vehicle. Escaped one trap only to set another. NATO had turned the sky into a funnel, and the MiGs were flying straight into it. Technically, Sweden had joined NATO 5 minutes ago, but you wouldn't know it from the way it was coordinated. Its pilots were getting real-time updates, heading, altitude, G-load, MiG heat signatures, even fuel estimates based on historical maneuvers. When one NATO pilot saw something, everyone saw it immediately, automatically. Meanwhile, the Russians were using voice commands over UHF, trying to coordinate like it was still the 1980s. They were essentially playing telephone, while NATO operated a fiber optic network. The lead MiG tried to fly west toward the open Baltic Sea, hoping to get into international airspace where the rules of engagement would be tightened. A sound plan, if only the F-35s hadn't seen it coming. Without even showing up on radar, the Italians had cut off their escape route. One Italian pilot activated his radar for exactly 1 second, just enough to set off the MiG's warning receiver, and then turned it off. Before the Russians could adjust, a second F-35 did the same from the other direction. Left, right, up, down. Warnings were coming from everywhere. The MiG swung from threat to threat, making sharp turns not to avoid missiles, but to avoid the possibility of being hit by missiles. They were fighting shadows. Realizing that maneuvering was not working, the second MiG activated its L-203B Gardenia jammer, a relic of Soviet electronic warfare doctrine. For the F-35's frequency-hopping AESA radar, which changes frequency thousands of times per second, Gardenia was essentially whispering into a jet engine. The Italians probably didn't even notice. Their radars automatically switched to untouched frequency bands faster than a human could blink. Meanwhile, the chessboard widened. Polish F-16s took off from Malbork. German Typhoons took off from Lodz. NATO Air Command didn't have to wait to be asked. The system combined radar data from every sensor across Europe, ground stations, AWACS, naval platforms, to create a single common operating picture. It then directed fighters from 5 countries into the engagement zone with mathematical precision. The MiGs thought they were testing Estonia. Instead, they set off a chain reaction in the region. NATO acted like a disturbed anthill. Fighters emerged from all directions, converging on 3 Russian jets that were rapidly running out of fuel, options, and most likely, morale. Then came the escalation point. The lead MiG pointed its nose toward Tallinn. Whether it was intentional or a consequence of navigation, it didn't matter. NATO command centers saw an armed Russian interceptor hurtling toward a residential area of 400,000 people. In a region scarred by history and proximity, the line between provocation and Article 5 incident is extremely thin. The F-35s didn't engage head-on. Instead, they engaged in what fighter pilots call sweeping, using the threat of engagement to push an adversary into a dangerous zone without firing a shot. An F-35 attacked the radar from the left, forcing the MiGs to turn right. As soon as they turned, a second F-35 attacked from below, forcing them to climb. Each response pushed the MiGs away from Tallinn and toward the emerging battle zone to the west, where Polish F-16s and German Typhoons were waiting. This was maneuver warfare in the information age, shaping, deterring, guiding, controlling. The Russians were not being pursued, they were being controlled. The MiGs' fuel situation was becoming a strategic vulnerability. 15 minutes of intense maneuvering had burned more fuel than expected. Returning to Kaliningrad was possible, just barely. But each defensive turn accelerated the countdown. If they ran out of fuel, they would not be able to make an emergency landing. They would become the focus of international attention for all the wrong reasons. A MiG-31 would quickly become a submarine when it ran out of fuel. The more sensible option would have been to request diversion to the nearest NATO airfield, Turku, Finland, or even Estonian air bases. But asking NATO for help after violating NATO airspace was politically unacceptable to the Russian pilots. So they continued flying blindly, burning fuel needed to get back to base. Then the Polish F-16s appeared from the west, loud, direct, and undisguised in their radar locks. Their APG-68 radars may not have been as sophisticated as the APG-81s. Within minutes, the Russian pilot was surrounded by 10 NATO fighter jets from 5 nations, the Italians lurking, the Swedes attacking from the south, the Poles from the west, the Germans from above, the Finns from the east. Every escape route intersected with missile fire, and NATO reinforcements continued to be deployed. Danish F-16s took off. Norwegian aircraft prepared for takeoff. Even the Dutch asked if they needed support. 3 Russian jets had inadvertently triggered a multinational rapid response exercise, but it wasn't an exercise. The MiG pilots, now fully aware of the situation, were experiencing what fighter pilots bluntly call a storm. Not an aerodynamic storm, but a psychological storm. When every threat alert tells you that you're only a second away from becoming a victim, decision-making becomes complicated. And the moment of extreme tension was just seconds away. As the Baltic skies teemed with NATO fighter jets, the MiG pilots knew the situation had gone far beyond a mere provocation. This was no longer a test of Estonia's air defenses. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered tactically, outcompeted in communications, and most importantly, running low on fuel. The real climax began when the leading Italian F-35 pilot quietly switched the radar mode from search to single-target tracking. This was the moment in every fighter pilot's career where training and life and death intersected. Single-target locking was unambiguous. It allowed no room for interpretation. Inside the MiG cockpit, the SPO-15 receiver emitted a constant, clear sound that everyone knew you couldn't ignore. It was an auditory reminder that someone out there had calculated your position, flight path, acceleration curve, and was now feeding that data into a missile with its own intelligence. The Italian pilot held the target lock precisely for 5 seconds, long enough to demonstrate capability, but not long enough to justify firing. Through the helmet-mounted display, the pilot monitored the firing solution, updated 50 times per second. A dotted line projected the AMRA-M missile's flight path. The predicted interception point appeared as a precise red X at the MiG-31 cockpit. Probability of kill? 97%. The remaining 3% was essentially pure optimism. Meanwhile, the Polish F-16s and German Typhoons were also establishing fire locks. The threat indicators within the MiGs exploded into a full symphony, multiple frequencies, multiple directions, a continuous cascading of sounds. The Russians weren't the target, they were surrounded by solutions. The tactical implication here was, when an aircraft receives simultaneous lock-on from different platforms, maneuvering to defeat one solution pushes it deeper into another. It's like choosing which wall to ram into in a closing room. This was the point where Soviet-era doctrine, emphasizing speed, aggression, and radar superiority, had nothing left to offer. And then came the breakthrough. The lead MiG finally transmitted a signal on the guard's frequency, its voice strained, broken, clearly trembling. Return to base. No defiant words, no fanfare. It was the most basic admission of defeat a fighter pilot could make without saying anything. The two remaining MiGs immediately flew west towards Kaliningrad, maintaining altitude just enough to conserve their remaining fuel. But NATO isn't stopping yet. Not aggressively, not politically, but informationally. Every move from here on out will be recorded, cataloged, analyzed, and archived in triplicate. This is how modern deterrence works, not by destruction, but by demonstration. The Swedish Gripen fighters moved into escort positions, moving precisely to the Russian 3 o'clock position at a distance of 500 meters, respectful but unmistakable. Close enough to count rivets, far enough to avoid collision if anyone panicked. Their targeting pods began recording in crisp 1080p, weapons load, pylon configuration, pod designation, tail number, details the Russian Air Force staff didn't want to give NATO intelligence. But here they were, in full HD. At the Polish border, Polish F-16s took on escort duties with a little more enthusiasm. Their radars kept their targets locked on, not enough to escalate, just enough to keep that warning chime ringing in the Russians' helmets for the entire 400-mile return trip. Officially, it was called aggressive escorting. Unofficially, it was called reminding them who owns the airspace. Link 16 made the handoff between nations seamless. Swedish mission computers communicated with Polish computers at 57 kilobits per second, passing packets of data back and forth containing the MiGs, positions, headings, fuel estimates, and maneuvering curves. German Typhoons hovered overhead, lurking, ready to attack if the Russians made any moves. Danish F-16s formed a barrier patrol further north. And Norway, which had never missed a Baltic security event, scrambled its planes in case another attack was needed. This was NATO's intended way of working, dispersed, unified, relentless. Meanwhile, inside the MiGs, the fuel warnings were becoming harder to ignore. The lead plane, which showed a weight of about 2,000 pounds, had only 30 minutes of range at its best. The Russians slowed to 420 knots, their engines burning almost no fuel. The Polish F-16s, accustomed to much higher speeds in their interceptor role, had to repeatedly apply their speed brakes to maintain formation. That in itself was a message. We're in control. You're just trying to get home. And then the final humiliation came. As the MiGs approached Kaliningrad airspace, Russian Su-27s scrambled to intercept them, perhaps expecting heroes returning with dramatic footage of the NATO invasion. Instead, they found 3 exhausted MiG-31s flying slower than passenger jets, flanked by NATO escorts on all sides, with pilots looking like they had just returned from a séance with every threat system in Europe. That day's briefing in Kaliningrad must have been unpleasant. For their part, the Italian F-35 pilots had barely used any fuel. After 2 hours of flying, they still had plenty of fuel left, because modern stealth tactics rely on position, information, and sensor networks, not brute force maneuvers. They turned west toward their base, having completed a mission in which they never had to reveal themselves until they volunteered to. They did not fire a single missile. They didn't even need to turn on their radar until the very last act. The technological disparity was so great it was almost unfair. This leads us to a strategic lesson. This incident wasn't about Estonia alone. It wasn't about airspace technicalities or even about the MiG-31. It was about the reality of 21st century air power. Networks beat platforms. Data beats speed. Integration beats brute force. NATO didn't respond as individual nations. It responded as a single organism, one mind with many eyes, many arms, many wings. Russia, meanwhile, demonstrated something unintentionally. Even their frontline interceptors cannot enter Baltic airspace without immediately triggering a multinational, multi-layered, multi-domain response. They didn't test NATO's weakness, they exposed their own. The Baltic remains unmistakably a NATO-controlled environment. So the final question is yours. What do you think would have happened if that submarine had stayed hidden another 30 minutes? Please leave a comment to let me know. Thank you and see you next video.